Shazam is one of those superheroes with a troubled history. Although modern audiences had never heard of him until the 2019 movie, he used to be the most popular superhero in the world, even outselling Superman and also becoming the first superhero to get his own live-action movie. Though, because of a bunch of legal shenanigans that I covered in my award-winning video on the subject, DC Comics managed to acquire the rights to what was once their biggest rival. But now that they had Shazam all to themselves, DC had no idea what to do with him, leading to a dark and gritty pitch for a reboot that was full of sex, violence, and featured a redesigned Shazam that was based on Michael Jackson. It never happened, and thank God for that. Hello and welcome to Comic Drake, where I talk about comic books and my name is Drake. Let's talk about it. Though, speaking of legal shenanigans, I want to give a big thank you to the law firm Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring today's video. Unfortunately, my girlfriend was recently in a car crash, and the lady that hit her didn't have insurance. Thankfully, she wasn't injured, but I know for a fact that getting a lawyer involved if she was would have been a long and annoying process. However, if you're injured and don't know where to start, Morgan & Morgan makes it so easy. They're a law firm for the modern era, and in only 8 clicks or less, you can submit a claim to Morgan & Morgan. You can even upload medical records and documents, sign contracts, and submit case details all over your phone and text your legal team at any time throughout your case, which means that with Morgan & Morgan, you can submit a claim without even having to leave your couch. So if you're ever injured in an accident, now you know about at least one resource. For more information, go to forthepeople.com or pick up your phone and call Pound Law. That's pound 529. Anyway, big thank you again to Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring today's video, but now, let's get back to it. So, like I mentioned earlier, I go into a lot more depth about the Shazam lawsuits in my dedicated video, but here are the important facts that you need to know from it for today. The character was originally known as Captain Marvel. DC sued its owner, Fawcett Comics, for being a Superman ripoff, and they won. So Fawcett stopped publishing the books and almost went bankrupt as a result. Years later, DC licensed the character from Fawcett, which is pretty wild and insulting considering all of their legal history. But in the time that he wasn't being published, a new company called Marvel Comics popped up, and they trademarked the name Captain Marvel, which means that now DC had to call their book Shazam, but they could still call him Captain Marvel inside of the comic. For a good while, DC Comics had their Captain Marvel and all of his books take place in an alternate universe, but there was the occasional crossover, the most notable of which were written by a guy named Roy Thomas. Now, Roy was a big shot writer and editor over at Marvel Comics, and was considered to be Stan Lee 2.0. He was a devoted company man who took over the X-Men when Stan Lee stopped writing them, and even became Marvel's editor-in-chief when Stan stepped down in 1972. During his 15-year tenure, Roy Thomas and Marvel Comics were synonymous, which is why it was a huge deal when DC managed to poach him for themselves. One of the big reasons why Thomas came over in the first place, though, was because he was a massive Captain Marvel fan, which is why, to no one's surprise, one of the first books that he wrote for DC was a crossover where Cap and Superman switched power sets. Thomas went on to write a few more crossovers between the two heroes, but his biggest dream was to create a full-on rebooted Shazam series. But DC didn't think that the time was right for it, though after a ton of persistent pestering, they eventually gave in, and artist Don Newton was brought on to draw the comic. Roy Thomas pitched the idea for one of Captain Marvel's companions to be named Captain Thunder as an homage to the original name that Fawcett was going to call their flagship character all the way back in the 30s. Roy's Captain Thunder was going to be a black teenager in a wheelchair named Willie Fawcett, and was set to replace Freddie Freeman, aka Captain Marvel Jr. But since DC didn't own the characters outright yet and were simply just licensing the Captain Marvel IP from Fawcett, Fawcett had a degree of control over the comics that they produced, and DC didn't think that they'd be cool with such a drastic redesign. Though that wouldn't matter because unfortunately the series artist Don Newton passed away in 1984, and the Shazam project was put on hiatus. That being said, Captain Marvel still appeared in plenty of comics since then, and was starting to get a lot of interest from fans. So DC went on ahead and put out a new miniseries called Shazam: The New Beginning, which rebooted the character. Written by Roy Thomas and his wife Dan, The New Beginning was noticeably darker in tone. Where the original Captain Marvel books were bright, silly, and goofy, this reboot opened with Billy Batson's parents dying in a car crash. So yeah, a little bit darker. Because he didn't want his Uncle Dudley to find a better paying job to support both him and Billy and give up his dream of being a magician, Batson opted to instead live with his uncle, Dr. Sivana. Sivana was abusive, and when Billy overheard that he was actually the one that orchestrated the car crash that killed his parents for the insurance money, he ran away. And while on the run, Billy was led into a tunnel where he found the wizard Shazam, who granted Billy his powers, thus becoming Captain Marvel. They also decided to take a villain from way back in the 40s that only appeared in one issue named Black Adam and rework him into a menacing main antagonist, setting him up as the dark parallel to Captain Marvel. Dude, when Black Adam found Billy in his non-superpowered form, he was willing to straight up murder the kid for talking back to him, not knowing that he was Captain Marvel. The New Beginning was really well received, so DC finally let Roy Thomas get his dream gig, a monthly ongoing Shazam comic. But his pitch was, different, to say the least. To kick things off, Captain Marvel's design was going to get a massive overhaul. Instead of being the big barrel-chested hero from the past, this new look was going to be leaner and have an emphasis on being cool. What that means is that he was going to try and emulate the icons of the era, like Bruce Springsteen, Clint Eastwood, Prince, and Michael Jackson. But definitely not Fred McMurray. They specifically wanted to make that clear. And yeah, the influence of these icons is extremely apparent. Like, if you told me that this was one of Prince or MJ's new costumes, I would totally believe you. Quick unrelated fun fact, there was actually a full-on Prince comic that was written by Dwayne McDuffie, the creator of Static Shock and the head writer of a lot of the Ben 10 series until his untimely death. It's not really relevant for this video, but I don't know when I'm ever going to get a chance to talk about Prince on this channel again, so yeah, there you go. Anyway, the first arc of this new Shazam series was going to introduce a new Mary Marvel. But unlike previous incarnations where she was Billy's sugary sweet sister, this new Mary was dark and had attitude. She goes by Spike, dresses in leather, and has a multicolored mohawk. She also has an abusive boyfriend who's trying to pressure her into being a prostitute, and was no longer Billy's sister so that she could be set up as a love interest for Batson and provide lots of sexual tension. Which is kinda weird considering that Billy is a child and she seems to be quite a bit older than him. But don't worry, Roy Thomas assures us that they are definitely the same age. The comic's first arc was going to set up the Marvel family, which allowed Thomas to reuse the concept of Captain Thunder that he had previously pitched. Although, he would have to pick a different name, because Roy decided to use it in a completely different project because he really liked the sound of it and was convinced that he was never actually going to get the opportunity to make this comic in the first place. The comic opened up with a nondescript Middle Eastern man threatening to blow up the Golden Gate Bridge in the name of an unnamed holy war if California didn't change the state bird to a camel. That's not a because comics moment. What the actual fuck, Roy? Though, after that situation was dealt with, the issue's next scene was going to have a legitimately funny bit. See, there was a kids show on local TV that was based on Captain Marvel, and when Billy asked if they had Cap's approval, the head of the station said that because Captain Marvel wasn't trademarked, then that was completely fair game. And that is all hilariously ironic considering the real-world trademarking shenanigans that the character had gone through over the years. I can't tell if this was meta or if it was just unintentionally brilliant. Afterwards, Spike tracks down and confronts Billy, saying that she saw him disappear into the tunnel and emerge as Captain Marvel back when he first got his powers. Billy drops all the exposition where he goes over his origin story with the wizard, and Spike demands that Batson take her to him to get the same superpowered makeover. Billy hesitates to agree initially, but then Spike starts shouting, "I know who Captain Marvel really is!" And when Billy tried to get her to be quiet, she gives him a black eye, and that somehow convinces him to comply. So essentially, Spike goes to the wizard and is like, "Hey, you punk-ass bitch, give me some damn superpowers." And despite disrespecting him, the wizard goes ahead and does just that. So now, Spike is Mary Marvel, with a much more revealing costume than her previous incarnation. There were actually multiple designs that were drawn up for Mary that featured all sorts of radical late 80s fashion. I especially like how this one is basically just the god-awful costume that Power Girl was wearing in the 90s, which I talk all about in my award-winning video on the history of Power Girl's costumes and boob window. Anyway, the first thing that Mary did when getting her powers was beat up her abusive boyfriend and raid a local mall to steal some clothes. Really though, that's all we know, because the artist on the project, Mark Beecham, took his sweet time on the project. And after about 6 months of waiting on the artwork, Roy Thomas started shopping around for a new artist. While all of that was going down though, a Shazam story was slated to appear in Action Comics Weekly, but since they wanted to save the big dramatic overhaul for the release of the Shazam solo comic, DC opted to keep Captain Marvel's appearance in these stories in line with his classic barrel-chested design. The new artist Frank Trevelyan fully penciled the first 2 issues of Roy Thomas's project, but DC changed their mind and wanted a new artist, Mike Gustovich, to take over and make major alterations to Trevelyan's work. But even then, DC wasn't satisfied, and by now, there were 2 or 3 fully drawn copies of the first issue. Oh, and on top of that, because the project was delayed for so long, DC demanded that the first issue be rewritten altogether so that Captain Marvel could be fully reintroduced to readers, even though The New Beginnings wasn't really all that old and took care of just that. It was decided that the first issue of the comic was now going to feature the redesigned Captain Marvel fighting the Teen Titans villain Mammoth. But then DC was like, nah, that plot's too basic for a first issue, it's not very exciting. And then they canceled the book entirely. Understandably, Roy Thomas was pissed, especially because in all of that time that the comic was being written and rewritten, drawn and redrawn, Thomas was told that he wasn't allowed to work on some of his favorite characters like the Spectre and Dr. Fate, but DC assured him that that was fair because he would still get to work on Shazam, which the company knew was his dream project. And now, he didn't even have that. All Roy Thomas had was wasted time and crushed dreams. To absolutely no one's surprise, Thomas left DC shortly thereafter. And actually, he did a lot less work in general for the big 2 moving forward. But when he did take writing gigs, he mostly went to Marvel instead of DC. And it really seemed like this entire experience seemed to sour his opinion on the modern comic book industry altogether. But it's still an interesting story of what could have been. A lot of the information for this video actually came from Roy's magazine Alter Ego, so big thank you to them. It's actually still coming out since the 60s, and it is a massive resource for learning all about comic history. But if you prefer it in video form, then why not check out another one of these videos, like maybe the Shazam lawsuit that I've talked about multiple times. I think it's pretty good, but I'm biased. Anyway, I hope you learned at least a little something new, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.